This is a lecture on the book of Proverbs, which gives practical wisdom for young people. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. This is part one of a two-part lecture on Proverbs. We'll cover the introduction, wisdom, and fear of the Lord. First of all, the authorship of Proverbs. Solomon is the main author. It talks about the Proverbs of Solomon in the first verse. In 1 Kings 4:32, it says that Solomon knew some 3,000 proverbs. The book of Proverbs itself only has 915 verses, so Solomon knew more than what is recorded in the book. And he collected some of his proverbs from all the foreigners with whom he had contact. Now, there are other authors of the book of Proverbs. One that's mentioned is King Lemuel in chapter 31 and verse 1. He seems to be a non-Israelite king, maybe an Ishmaelite king. In any case, he's not Solomon. And then in chapter 30 and verse 1, you have an author by the name of Agur, also is not Solomon. It looks like Hezekiah's men also were involved. In chapter 25 and verse 1, it says, "These two are proverbs of Solomon, which were gathered by Hezekiah's men." Well, Hezekiah was king of Israel a couple of centuries after Solomon. And so collecting the Proverbs of Solomon into the book as we now have it is a process that took centuries. And then there's also the sayings of the wise. That's a title in 22:17 and 24:23. And the wise seem to be another identification of authors. A little bit about the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:17 through 24:33. It says, 22:17, "Pay attention and listen to the sayings of the wise." And 24:23 says, "These also are sayings of the wise." And it looks like these wise is a way of referring to authorship. What's interesting here is that this unit of Proverbs, 22:17 through 24:33, which are labeled the sayings of the wise, have broad similarities with Egyptian wisdom literature, particularly a work called The Instruction of Amen-Emopet, which dates to around 1000 BC. And so some proverbs perhaps were collected from abroad rather than invented by Solomon. The sayings of Amen-Emopet are written in various forms, and here's a fragment of that work on the right. The outline of the book starts with a preamble that gives the purpose of the book, chapter 1, 1 through 7. But then from there, 1:8 through the end of chapter 9, it has a discourse on wisdom that gives more general statements about the need to listen to wisdom. And then you have Solomonic Proverbs from 10:1 to 22:16. Then you have the sayings of the wise, 22:17 through 24:34. Then you have more Solomonic Proverbs in chapters 25 through 29. Then you get to the sayings of Agur in chapter 30, the sayings of Lemuel in 31, 1 through 9. And then you have an acrostic poem on the virtuous woman, 31, 10 through 31. It goes from A to Z, or Aleph to Tav, each line of poetry starting with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So there's 22 letters, and therefore there's 22 verses. Chapter 1, 2 through 7 give us the purpose of the book. It's for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. Here it says something about the purpose of the book. Notice that it's addressed especially to the young. In verse 4, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. So the young are especially emphasized here. But even an older person, a wise person, can listen and add to their learning. So whether you're young or old, the book of Proverbs does have something for you. But it's especially addressed to the young. You might notice also the father-son type language in the book. For example, chapter 1 and verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. So you get this parent to child type language off and on in this book, which suggests that it is especially written for young people. Though it's more adolescents than small children, because there is a discussion on sexual temptation, which would not apply to young children. One of the purposes of the book is for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life. Many areas of prudent advice are found in this book. It talks about the ideal wife and ideal person or husband, the child rearing, friendship, relations with the unwise or the ungodly, how to handle money, sexual temptations, all kinds of practical areas. The wisdom of Proverbs represents, you might say, the law applied practically in ordinary daily life. Like the law, Proverbs promises a long life to those that listen to wisdom. In the law, it promises a long life if you obey, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land. But the same language is used for proverbial sayings, my son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years. You might say that Proverbs teaches religion outside the church. We don't spend all of our time in church worshiping God. What do you do the rest of the time when you're not at church? Well, Proverbs tells us how to conduct ourselves in the realm of religion, even when you're not at church, even when you're in a secular environment. Now, perhaps one of the most useful ways of studying Proverbs is to pick a topic and use a concordance to find out everything about that topic in Proverbs, and then try to put it all together into a coherent whole or into a system. And so I'd like to do that with a few subjects. For example, wisdom. The Hebrew word is chokmah. What is wisdom? The basic meaning of the root hakam, which means to be wise, is actually to be skillful. And the use of the noun chokmah, wisdom, in Exodus 35 and Psalm 107 illustrates that the meaning has to do with skillfulness at living. In Exodus 35, it says, see, the Lord is called by name Bezalel, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom. I'm reading from the New American Standard. And in understanding and in knowledge and in all craftsmanship, to make designs for working in gold and silver and bronze, and in cutting of stones for settings, and in carving of wood, so as to perform every inventive work. He has filled them with skill, and the word skill, by the way, is wisdom, to perform every work of an engraver and a designer and of an embroiderer in blue and in purple and in scarlet material and in fine linen, and of a weaver as performers of every work and maker of designs. Now, the key words here are the word wisdom and the word skill. The word wisdom and skill are both the same word in Hebrew, chokmah, and it refers, in this case, to the skill of craftsmanship in stone, in metalwork, in dealing with linen, in skill in engraving, in designing, and embroidering. Psalm 107 and verse 27 goes along with that. There it says in the NIV, the sailors reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end, speaking about a stormy sea. And at their wits' end is literally all their wisdom was compounded. Uses that Hebrew word chokmah. And here the wisdom, the chokmah, refers to the skill of sailors ruddering a ship through stormy seas. Again, it's a practical skill, this wisdom. Similar imagery is used in Proverbs 1 and verse 5. Let the discerning get guidance. The word rendered guidance means literally steering. And again, it's used of steering or navigating a ship. And wisdom in Proverbs is a form of steering or navigating through life. Wisdom is skillfulness at living. It's not intelligence. A high IQ is no guarantee of wisdom. Wisdom is practical and not so much theoretical. Philosophers, intellectuals, and theoreticians are not necessarily wise in the biblical sense. It depends on how they conduct themselves in life. And wisdom then means living in harmony with God's order in the universe and thus being successful at life. Now, there's a couple of aspects to wisdom. The first is skillfulness, but the second aspect of wisdom is godliness. And godliness is related to the term fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9 and verse 10. You might call that piety. Fearing God is the beginning of wisdom, and God is the source of wisdom. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding, Proverbs 2 and verse 6. Biblical wisdom then is religious, connected to fear of the Lord. Now, this is in contrast with Egyptian wisdom literature, to which we made some mention. Biblical wisdom makes fear of the Lord a first principle of wisdom, but ancient extra-biblical Egyptian wisdom literature is pretty much purely secular. The gods play little, if any, role in the wisdom that's contained there. Now, in speaking of wisdom, we should mention Lady Wisdom. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom came to be personified as a woman. You find this especially in Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 8 and chapter 9. Wisdom is personified as a lady calling on fools to come and learn from her. Lady Wisdom is almost a hypostasis or a substance or essential divine attribute of God himself. It's interesting that Solomon can make a lady the personification of wisdom. He was not sexist, although the Hebrew word wisdom is a feminine noun, which relates to why a woman was chosen to personify wisdom. Proverbs 8:22 through 31 is one of the places where this takes place. Lady Wisdom herself is speaking, and she says this: "The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. I was appointed from eternity, from the beginning, before the world began. When there were no oceans, I was given birth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the earth or its fields or any of the dust of the world, I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight, day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world and delighting in mankind. So Lady Wisdom was there at creation. Now, some have looked at this passage and see it as a messianic prophecy, as it were. And there's at least similarities between Lady Wisdom and Christ. And the chart on the left gives you a number of examples of those. Wisdom existed before creation. Well, in the beginning was the Word. Christ was before creation, John chapter 1 and verse 1. Wisdom is the craftsman through whom God created. Hebrews and John 1:3 says that through Christ, God the Father created the world. Lady Wisdom is given the name Wisdom, and Christ is associated with wisdom and is called Wisdom. He himself increased in wisdom in Luke chapter 2. He was known for his wisdom, Mark chapter 6. He claimed to be greater than Solomon in his wisdom in Matthew 12 and Luke 11. And when Christ says wisdom is vindicated by her deeds or children, in Matthew 11 and Luke 7, he's claiming that his actions are the same as those of Lady Wisdom. Christ is in fact referred to as the wisdom of God by Paul in 1 Corinthians 1. And there's other similarities. Wisdom is associated with riches and honor and wealth. And Paul in Colossians 2 says that in Christ are all the treasuries of wisdom. Lady Wisdom rejoices and delights in the world of mankind, and the love of Christ is expressed by dying for our sins. Proverbs promises blessings on those that keep Lady Wisdom's ways and words in Proverbs 8:32 and 34. Well, blessed are those who do what Christ commanded, and those knowing the things that Jesus Christ and does them. In Proverbs, whoever finds wisdom finds life, but a number of statements in the Gospels that whoever finds Christ finds life. And wisdom was chosen before the world began. Christ was chosen before the foundation of the world, 1 Peter 1. And one must choose wisdom or folly in Proverbs chapter 9, the latter being the path of destruction and death. And so we must choose either Christ or the devil, or the Christ or the world, the devil and the flesh, and the latter being the path of death. And so some have seen these similarities between Lady Wisdom and Christ as an indication that this is a messianic prophecy. In fact, one group that did that are the Arians, who argued from Proverbs chapter 8 that Christ was a created being, that wisdom was created or born before the foundation of the world. But against that point of view, was there a time when God didn't have wisdom? And once you ask the question, it's obvious that God always had wisdom. And so it's not that wisdom at one point didn't exist and then was created, which is what the Arians say about Christ, that Christ is the archangel Michael and is not really God, but is associated with God. But you can't really get that from Proverbs chapter 8, because even if it were a messianic prophecy, because wisdom always existed, just as does God the Son, Jesus Christ. Moreover, the passages in Proverbs that talk about Lady Wisdom are not precisely messianic prophecy. Christ is the real embodiment of wisdom. and therefore he shares the characteristics of Lady Wisdom, but it's not a direct prediction. And therefore the Arian argument is wrong in that sense as well. Christ lives up to the ideals of wisdom and therefore has these similarities. Another subject study is the fear of the Lord. What does it mean to fear God? Well, the Proverbs give us a definition in Proverbs 8 and verse 13. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. That may not be what you thought of when you ask, well, what does it mean to fear God? But it says the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. You get similar things in the wisdom book of Job. Job 1:8, have you considered my servant Job? Fearing God and turning away from evil. In close association with fearing God is turning away from evil. Likewise, in Job 28:28, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Here you have poetic parallelism. Parallel with fear of the Lord is to depart from evil. Now, you also have in Genesis 22 a story that illustrates what fear of the Lord is about. It has a story of the sacrifice of Isaac, when Abraham took Isaac up to Mount Moriah and was told to take your son, your only son, and offer him up as a burnt offering. And he was about to do that very thing when the angel of the Lord intervened and said, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said, and do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So what does it mean to fear God? Fearing God means to obey what God commands. Psalm 33 and verse 8 gives us another definition of fear of the Lord. There it says, let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. So fearing God is parallel with revering God. Note the synonymous parallelism. That implies a similar meaning. If you fear God, you revere him. So let's put it all together and make a definition that incorporates all the verses that we've just looked at. Fear of the Lord is that awe or reverence or respect which a person has for God, which causes that person to turn away from evil and keep God's commandments. Reverence comes from that verse in Psalms. Turning away from evil comes from Job and Proverbs, and keeping God's commandment from the story of Abraham and Isaac. Fear of the Lord is not terror. You have a passage where fear of God comes into play in Exodus 20, verses 18 through 22, where on Mount Sinai, the people were terrified of the phenomena on Mount Sinai and were afraid and were wanting to run away. But Moses reassures them, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. Now, this is a little bit ironic. He says, do not be afraid, but God has come so that fear will be with you. And what it means is don't be terrified, don't run away. But God has come that fear of God that causes you to turn away from evil and keep God's commandment, will be with you to keep you from sinning. Goes along with that definition we have above. Well, anyway, the definition that you often hear when you ask people what is fear of the Lord about is stronger than reverence. It has to do with turning away from sin and obeying God's commandments as well. In the second part of our lecture, we'll continue with subject studies on the simple the ideal person, the ideal spouse, and the hermeneutics of Proverbs.